All right, we are back on episode 3 of the Persuasion Project's Dharma Talk series. Once again, we are covering The Heart of the Buddhist Teaching by Thich Nhat Hanh. This is, again, extemporaneous. This is live on stream. There will be some conversations back and forth. We'll be reading over the book and then having some commentary and discussion. We are now on Understanding the Buddhist Teaching, Chapter 4. When we hear a Dharma talk or study a sutra, our only job is to remain open. Usually when we hear or read something new, we just compare it to our own ideas. If it is the same, we accept it and say that it is correct. If it is not, we say it is incorrect. In either case, we learn nothing. If we read or listen with an open mind and an open heart, the rain of the Dharma will penetrate the soil of our consciousness. And then he has a passage from a poem. The gentle spring rain penetrates the soil of my soul. A seed that has lain deeply in the earth for many years just smiles. While reading or listening, we don't work too hard. Be like the earth. When the rain comes, the earth only has to open herself up to the rain. Allow the rain of the Dharma to come in and penetrate the seeds that are buried deep in your own consciousness. A teacher cannot give you the truth. The truth is already in you. You only need to open yourself, body, mind, and heart, so that his or her teachings will penetrate your own seeds of understanding and enlightenment. If you let the words enter you, the soil and the seeds will do the rest of the work. Yeah, so that's another very fundamental idea that for newcomers is very important. As described before, we are a composite of all of our beliefs, our experiences, our memories. We are subject to change. We are changing as we speak. Every moment is change. And so to be open to teachings or practice like this is to just maintain a casual, open attitude. I believe even somebody who came from a very rigid Christian perspective can appreciate some of these doctrines. You'll find that even a lot of the teachings of Christ very clearly have parallels. And you might not know this, but one of the most popular religions that sprung up just shortly after the death of Jesus was a religion called Manichaeism. Manichaeism is this weird hybrid of Persian Zoroastrianism with the teachings of Christ synergized with Buddhism, in which Jesus himself is portrayed as being an emanation of the Buddha. So yes, even a person who was very doctrinally stuck in Christianity can appreciate these teachings if they allow themselves to be open to it. I don't ask you to change. I ask you to be open to being persuaded. That is all. That is the clear approach that is necessary to learn these things. Moving forward, the transition of the teachings of the Buddha can be divided into 3 streams: Source Buddhism, Many School Buddhism, and Mahayana Buddhism. Source Buddhism includes all of the teachings the Buddha gave during his lifetime. 140 years after the Buddha's great passing away, the Sangha divided into 2 schools. Mahasanghika, literally majority, referring to those who wanted changes, and Shaviranvada, oof, that one was rough. Literally school of elders, referring to those opposed to the changes advocated by the Mahasanghikas. Sanskrit is so hard. So he's describing the very beginning of the divide between the 2 major Buddhist schools. The school of the elders, which would then eventually become what is referred to as Theravada, or kind of derogatorily referred to by other Buddhists as Hinayana. It is a very rigid, originalist perspective of Buddhism that has its place, has its merits, but many view it as being limited in scope. Theravada is by far the minority these days. They tend to operate primarily in Sri Lanka, in parts of Southeast Asia, so most of Thailand, part of Burma or Myanmar, and part of Cambodia. And then obviously diaspora communities do it. There are still Theravadas who practice in parts of India, but the overwhelming majority of Buddhists are some form of Mahayana, or the greater vessel, the idea of like expanding the teachings into broader horizons. You find this all throughout the rest of South Asia, China, Japan, Korea. it would spread throughout the Silk Road, even as far into like the eastern provinces of Rome. Like it went a distance. I tend to favor Mahayana practices because I believe that it focuses far more on a grander liberation. The key distinction for a layperson to understand between Theravada and Mahayana is Theravada is far more focused on personal liberation, while Mahayana tends to focus on the bodhisattva path. The idea that you will intentionally forego complete and total nirvana for the explicit goal of staying around to be able to assist all sentient beings to join you in liberation. In this sense, there are kind of like tiers of enlightenment. It's its whole own subject. But Thich Nhat Hanh is Mahayana. I lean Mahayana. That is a bias, so keep that in mind in the discussions. It is not necessarily the only framework to understand Buddhism, and there are many Buddhists who do not adhere to a Mahayana framework. But all Buddhists agree on some of the key fundamentals of the teachings of Shakyamuni Buddha, or Siddhartha Gautama. I'll likely refer to him as Shakyamuni a lot. That means the sage of the Shakya clan, the clan that the Buddha was from. Let's see. 100 years after that, the Svarandvada divided into two branches. Svaranstivada, the school that proclaims everything is, and the Vibhan Javya... Oh, I'm really struggling with that one. Vibhajavada, the school that discriminates. The Vibhajavadians support the king Ashoka, flourished in the Ganges Valley, while the Sarvastivandins went north to Kashmir. So this sort of describes the beginning of the politicization of Buddhism. So in the history of India, and honestly, there's a video that I really want to cover from like a historical reaction. I believe the Extra Credits people did one on the reign of Ashoka, who is considered like the first real king of India. Prior to that point, India was a series of sort of disparate groups that all shared a kind of like a common religious cultural background, but were like their own separate kingdoms, their own separate ethnicities. And so Ashoka was like the first real imperial sort of taking over different areas. And he really took on Buddhism as a sort of, that was his thing. Okay. And so it rubbed a lot of people the wrong way, and it really jump-started Buddhism as a movement, but it caused its own counter traditions. And as Buddhism became political in the Ashokan kingdom, a lot of those who did not agree with that orthodoxy that began to emerge within the court culture would then begin to move north into the Silk Road and would travel and proselytize into Tibet, into China, thusly into Korea, into Japan, and some would continue westward far into the steppe. So it's a fascinating subject. 400 years during and after the Buddha's lifetime, his teachings were transmitted only orally. After that, monks in the Tamrashatiya school, those who wear copper-colored robes in Sri Lanka, a derivative of the Vibhajavada school, that one sucks to say, began to think about writing the Buddha's discourses on palm leaves, and it took another 100 years to begin. By that time, it is said that there was only one monk who had memorized the whole canon, and that he was somewhat arrogant. The other monks had to persuade him to recite the discourses so they could write them down. When we hear this, we feel a little uneasy, knowing that an arrogant monk may not have been the best vehicle to transmit the teachings of the Buddha. This is a tricky one. A lot of these like ancient religions, so much of it is oral transmitted history. Right, so we don't really know with complete confidence the legitimacy of a lot of these things. That's one of those big issues. But the way I see it is, unlike with the Christianity, where if the events in the Bible did not happen, it fundamentally alters the very way that you can perceive that religion. It ceases being internally consistent. If the flood didn't happen, it completely rewrites the entire way things worked. If, say, Exodus didn't happen, completely fucks with everything. Shocker, but there's basically no archaeological evidence for either of those. Christianity is, well, frankly, the Abrahamic religions are a lineage and a, like, sort of a faith based on a historical understanding of a series of events. But Buddhism is fundamentally a principles religion, where these principles will consist whether the text was lost or not. It is apparent to one who spends time to contemplate the very nature of the Four Noble Truths. It is, to some extent, obvious. It just needs to be revealed to you. So in a weird way, yeah, it's a shame that we do not have the primary documents. That would be ideal, but as far as I'm concerned, it doesn't really matter. The principles still hold true today because it is principle-based. It is based on observations of the lived experience, and that hasn't changed in a way that lack of documentation would fundamentally alter the perception of the religion. Continuing onward, even during the Buddha's lifetime, there were people such as the monk Adita who misunderstood the Buddha's teachings and conveyed them incorrectly. It is also apparent that some of the monks who memorized the sutras over the centuries did not understand their deepest meaning, or at the very least they forgot or changed some words. As a result, some of the Buddha's teachings were distorted even before they were written down. Before the Buddha attained full realization of the path, for example, he had tried various methods to suppress his mind, and they did not work. In one discourse he recounted, I thought, why don't I grit my teeth, press my tongue against my palate, and use my mind to repress my mind? Then, as a wrestler might take hold of the head or the shoulders of someone weaker than he, and in order to restrain and coerce that person, he has to hold him down constantly without letting go for a moment. So I gritted my teeth, pressed my tongue against my palate, and used my mind to suppress my mind. As I did this, I was bathed in sweat. Although I was not lacking in strength, although I maintained mindfulness and did not fall from mindfulness, my body and my mind were not at peace, and I was exhausted by striving. Even though the painful feelings that arose in my body were not able to overwhelm my mind. So this kind of goes on to that idea of like forcefulness and like, you know, that abstraction from those aesthetic lifestyles that he used to be a part of, where like this intense fixation isn't necessarily furthering your goals down the path. All right, we have a pretty long one. All right, a first chatter. Welcome aboard. I used to tremble in fear and drop to my knees when I'd see a big, strong, sweaty man who could try to touch my face with his clammy hands, but now I started doing push-ups, and once I get big, I'm going to go to the beach and flex in front of all the smaller men. I don't know what that's about, but that is extremely funny to just randomly drop in this conversation. You do you. I'll tie it to Buddhism, though. I feel like that desire, that craving to be perceived as strong yourself, suggests something of your upbringing. Why do you feel it necessary to flex in front of people? What does that truly gain you? Do you truly gain happiness from that? Or is it simply that you have had expectations laid upon you, and that only by trying to meet those expectations do you feel that happiness is possible? I don't believe this to be true. I believe that you will do those push-ups, you will try to flex in front of smaller men, and it will give you fleeting happiness, but that happiness too will be impermanent. And much with the rest of your body, which is also impermanent, it is something that will pass with time. As you grow older, younger men and stronger men will flex in front of you, and the cycle will continue. Such is the way. Seriously though, what was that about? Yeah, Dharma Talk. I love it. See, the Buddha too would receive extremely batshit commentary. I gotta find some of it. A lot of the Pali Canon literally reads as like, some dude says some weird shit while the Buddha's giving a speech, and the Buddha has to like, okay, and he'll have to like give a really roundabout way. Like, you have to understand that while he was enlightened, he was a person. And he was a pretty funny person, to be completely honest. He said some wacky shit. Alright, let's see. Proceeding onward, obviously the Buddha was telling us not to practice in this way. Yet this passage was later inserted into other discourses to convey the exact opposite of the meaning. Just as a wrestler takes hold of the head or the shoulders of someone weaker than himself, restrains and coerces that person, and holds him down constantly, not letting go for one moment, so a monk who meditates in order to stop all wholesome thoughts and desire and aversion, when these thoughts continue to arise, should grit his teeth, press his tongue against his palate, and do his best to use his mind to beat down and defeat his mind. Yeah, so that's like completely missing the point. The original point being, like, this intense fixation is in and of itself inducing your own form of suffering. And then the monk basically translated it to, like, covering your eyes, plugging your ears, and, like, trying to not acknowledge the rest of reality, not to come to terms with things, to come to terms with your own thoughts. There are other instances where teachings of the Buddha have been inserted in the wrong place. For instance, the teaching of the 12 links of conditioned Genesis, to be discussed in chapter 27, has been inserted in many sutras where they do not belong to explain the cycle of rebirth and death, where in fact the sutras are about the transcendence of birth and death. They have been wrongfully inserted in the... I'm not even going to bother say the Pali for that one. The discourse on the middle way. Often we need to study several discourses and compare them in order to understand which is true teachings of the Buddha. It is like stringing precious jewels together to make a necklace. If we see each sutra in light of the overall body of teachings, we will not be attached to any one teaching. With comparative study and looking deeply into the meaning of these texts, we can surmise what is a solid teaching that will help us practice and what is probably an incorrect transmission. Yeah, so this this is another pretty fundamental idea. Critical thinking. This is not meant to be dogmatic. If you are engaging in the Buddhist texts, your goal is to try to interpret them. And anybody in the modern era knows that media literacy is terrible these days. So try to interpret it. Try to have an open mind. But compare and contrast. See which seems more internally consistent. Which makes more sense. The Buddha teaching of the middle way and how asceticism is not the path forward. And then a passage talking about how you need to, like, clench your mouth and, like, how do you even, like, shove your tongue against the roof of your mouth? Weird. Like, it even those who are very studied and very versed in these subjects can be lost in misunderstanding, like the monk who had translated that passage. It happens. We are human, but we need to work together to try to come up with a solution that makes more sense, that is more coherent. As someone traumatized by Christianity, the encouragement of evaluating the teachings is fucking awesome. How liberating. No, again, like, I hate to say it, but it's like, the problem is early Christian teachings, I'm talking before the Nicene Creed, were also this way. It is a shame. I believe that Gnostic Christianity and Buddhism have a lot of synergy together, where you can combine those good aspects of Jesus without all of the weird sin and baggage, and there actually being critical thinking and analysis. It really is shocking. Again, like, I kind of have a weird abstracted perspective to where, again, I can say truly that I never attended a singular church service until I was like 22, and it was for a funeral of a family friend. So I got to kind of see the poisons of Christianity in the United States and how it leaches into kind of like the very framework of our personhood. But from a perspective where it was not being like forced on me, it was just kind of in the cultural osmosis. And so I was able to see it as what it was, a means of control. There is much that you can gain and learn from those practices, but so much of it is just power and dogma. And Buddhism fundamentally strives for the understanding of the teachings for oneself. You cannot become enlightened by reading a book. You can use it as a mechanism or vehicle for enlightenment, but it is but a means to an end. It is not the end in and of itself. Yeah, suffering for righteousness' sake sounds like that Buddhism you mentioned. Mahayana? Yeah. Is that what you're referring to? Yes. Yeah, so Mahayana being the greater vehicle. Yeah, the expanded teaching school. Yes. So, yeah, so the trick is Buddhist texts are so fucking hard to, like, because they were originally written, so Sanskrit is technically older. And so Sanskrit is in the Indo-European language category group. So ironically, Sanskrit and Germanic languages are very closely related, where there is consistent grammar and a couple words that are very close. But then you'll have these like consonant stacked, really complicated phrases. And so what tends to happen a lot with language is as a language disperses to a group that also tends to have pretty low literacy, words will become contracted. So much like a cannot becomes can't, Sanskrit became Pali, where Pali would sort of remove a lot of unnecessary consonants and then just like squash them. The best example of this that combines the two, think of the word ignite. The word ignite means to, set ablaze, to start burning. In Sanskrit, the word for ignite is Agni. You can even see that it's very similar. Agni, ignite. In Pali, it goes from Agni to Agi. It gets rid of the it just shortens it. And so when you read these Buddhist passages, some of it is in the original Pali, which is a far more... the difference between vulgar Latin and like scripture Latin. And then like some of the scholars will then like write it in Sanskrit for like religious theocratical purposes. And then you'll have like where it's Pali in one part and then Sanskrit in another. It is so challenging to follow. So yeah, expect a lot of mistranslations, but the key part is the mistranslations are not making fun of. It is a genuine effort to try to read the text the way it is. It is just exceedingly challenging from a framework in which Sanskrit and Pali are just not in the common lexicon. It's kind of like asking a random Protestant Christian to do an entire sermon in Latin. Like go to like a Baptist church and tell the dude, yeah, give your sermon in Latin, because the book was at one point in Latin. Like, it's not... Language is funny. Oh, what do you know? If literally the next passage, he's talking about it. That's going to happen a lot, I feel. By the time the Buddha's discourses were written down in Pali in Sri Lanka, there were 18 or 20 schools, and each had its own recension of the Buddha's teachings. These schools did not tear the teachings of the Buddha apart, but were threads of a single garment. A number of these recensions exist today. So in Buddhism, one of the sort of key cardinal sins, if you want to come up with that idea, is intentionally trying to cause a splinter in the Sangha, the Buddhist community, on purpose, typically for the goal of like... You like making your own religion kind of thing, right? Like it is meant to prevent some sort of rogue teacher to sort of hijack it. And that idea is far less of like it's actually going to like fuck up your rebirth. It's far more of like a warning about the importance of community and maintaining cohesion within the Sangha. But it was a concern then, and it remains a concern now. The Pali Canon contains the recension that originated with the Tamrashitaya school, and the Chinese and Tibetan canons contain recensions from another of other schools, Sarvastivada being the most prominent. Sarvastivada and the Tamrashitaya recensions were written down at about the same time. The former was written down in Pali, and the latter in Sanskrit. Other schools used other Indian languages and Prakrit. Not sure what Prakrit is. I'm gonna look it up. This is one of those, I don't recall that word. It's important to try to understand what is being said. Okay, it is a type of vernacular, sort of like hybrid language of the region. Kind of like a pidgin or a Creole. Okay. The sutras that were written down in Pali in Sri Lanka are known as the Southern Transmission. The Sarvastivada texts, known as the Northern Transmission, exist in Sanskrit only in fragmented form. Fortunately, they were translated into Chinese and Tibetan, and many of these traditions are still available. We have to remember that the Buddha did not speak Pali, Sanskrit, or Prakrit. It is surmised that he spoke a language close to Pali, and some think it was Ardhamagadi, and there is no record of the Buddha's words in his own language. So that language is kind of like a... It has traditions in southern Nepal and northern India. Obviously, I don't believe that exists today either. Language is tricky. It makes things so challenging. We don't appreciate just how the situation goes. Let me see how many more pages are left. Okay, I will wrap up this section and then I'll be moving on to another activity. By comparing equivalent sutras in Pali and Chinese canons, we can see teachings must have preceded Buddhism's dividing into schools. When the sutras in both canons are the same, we can conclude that what they say must have been there before the division. When the recessions are different, we can surmise that one or both might be incorrect. The northern transmission preserved some discourses better, and the southern transmission preserved others better. That is the advantage of having two transmissions to compare. The third stream of the Buddhist teaching, Mahayana Buddhism, arose in the 1st century BCE. During the time the schools of Buddhism, there were some monks who started to live a life completely divorced from the rest of the society. The lay people were concerned only with making offerings and supporting the monks. So in traditional Buddhism, I'm sending a message. There is this idea of the dynamic between the lay people and the monastic group. And so one of the criticisms of this era in early Buddhism is that the monastics kind of were like the clerics up in the mountains, and they would only deign to interact with the lay people for like very specific ceremonies and rituals. And that was believed as being very counterintuitive to the way that Buddhism should work as a sort of grander community sort of goal. And so that was one of the key ideas of why Mahayana came about. That is why at this time there arose among Buddhist lay as well as monastic practitioners the idea of popularizing Buddhism. From this sprouted the Mahayana way of thinking. It was a movement aimed at developing the deep sources of Buddhist thought and reviving the tremendous energy of bodhicitta, or the mind of love, and bringing Buddhism back into contact with life. This was the Mahayanizing movement of Buddhism. These three streams complement one another. It was impossible for source Buddhism to remember everything the Buddha had taught, so it was necessary for schools Buddhism and Mahayana Buddhism to renew teachings that had been forgotten or overlooked. Like all traditions, Buddhism needs to renew itself regularly in order to stay alive and grow. The Buddha always found new ways to express his awakening. Since the Buddha's lifetime, Buddhists have continued to open new Dharma doors to express and share the teachings begun in the Deer Park and Sarnath. Please remember that a sutra or a Dharma talk is not insight in and of itself. It is a means of presenting insight using words and concepts. Yes, as what I said before, this is meant to be a guide point for you to have your own introspective comparisons and understanding with the text and with the actual Dharma talk itself. You can't just follow it directly and adhere to it directly and expect to achieve gains. You must process it and work through it. And the best way to do that is the question and answer process. When you use a map to get to Paris, once you have arrived, you can put away the map and enjoy being in Paris. If you spend all your time with the map, if you get taught by the words and notions presented by the Buddha, you'll miss the reality. The Buddha said many times, "My teaching is like a finger pointing to the moon." Do not mistake the finger for the moon. In the Mahayana Buddhist tradition, it is said, if you explain the meaning of every word and phrase in the sutras, you slander the Buddhas of the 3 times, past, present, and future. But if you disregard even one word of the sutra, you risk speaking the words of Mara. Mara, again, being the sort of kind of personified concept of, again, craving, desire, degeneration. Sutras are essential guides for our practice, but we must read them carefully and use our own intelligence and help of a teacher and a sangha to understand the true meaning and put it into practice. After reading a sutra or any spiritual text, we should feel lighter, not heavier. Buddhist teachings are meant to awaken our true self, not merely add to our storehouse of knowledge. From time to time, the Buddha refused to answer a question posed to him. The philosopher Vatsagotra asked, "Is there a self?" The Buddha did not say anything. Vatsagotra persisted. Do you mean there is no self? But the Buddha still did not reply. Finally, Vatsagotra left. Ananda, the Buddha's attendant, was puzzled. Lord, why you always teach that there is no self? Why did you not say so to Vatsagotra? The Buddha told Amandra that he did not reply to Vatsagotra because Vatsagotra was looking for a theory, not a way to remove obstacles. So I hope it describes this in the near future, but there is a very important sort of Buddhist parable called the parable of the poisoned arrow. And it kind of goes to this idea that like a lot of these questions about very existential things are getting in the way of us actually making progress. And so by denying this person this answer, it sort of, forces them to really kind of come to terms of like, well, why am I asking this question? Am I actually seeking to understand, or am I seeking to add it to a sort of ego-driven kind of hoarding of knowledge? On another occasion, the Buddha heard a group of disciples discussing whether or not he had said such and such, and he told them, "For 45 years I have not uttered a single word." He did not want his disciples to be caught by words or notions, even his own. Can you imagine that? I love that. Your followers are like basically gossiping about your teachings, and then you approach them and be like, "I've said nothing to you," and then just dips. There's just so much of that in the early teachings. It is genuinely funny at times. When an archaeologist finds a statue that has been broken, he invites sculptors to specialize in restoration to study the art of the period and repair that statue. We must do the same. If we have an overall view of the teachings of the Buddha, when a piece is missing or has been added, we have to recognize it and repair the damage. So yeah, it goes to the idea that these are living documents. The people who lived then weren't special. We're not special. We are all part of a greater whole as far as the Sangha. And part of that is, again, pursuing knowledge and pursuing ways to sort of mend or fix potential misunderstandings. It is a fluid text. Much like with all of existence, there is impermanence, there is non-self, and both of which are very crucial to the idea that these documents can just fade, be misunderstood, be mistranslated, and it is fundamental to a Buddhist framework that we have to perceive them with a critical lens and to engage in, actual media literacy, in addition to our spiritual studies. And so that concludes chapter 4. Do we have any final questions before we call an end to this one? Why his ears so long, though? The Buddha, you mean? That's one of those, like, yeah, in some of the statues it is depicted that way. I feel like there's probably some sort of symbolism there. Basically, most sculptures or most depictions of Buddha or Buddhas, there are actually more than one in Mahayana. There are quite a few, actually. The posture and the shapes of different things of their body have some sort of symbolic meaning. So it's like, I can't say this with confidence, but it could be like, oh, well, by having his ears more outstretched, he can listen to the calls of those who are asking for liberation. I could come up with some sort of weird... It is an interesting one. I do wonder if there is a literal, there is a specific text that describes why that is. But there are specific texts for other reasons why posture is as it is. Here's what I can do. Let me... Had to get rid of his drip. Now his ears are fucked with the gauge. Maybe. Yeah, I mean, shit. Sometimes you gotta. Could have just been that a gauge that matched that time or something. I'm not certain. Yeah, I can't say with confidence. That idea of, ear implants is not, new. Just because it was, pop culture and, fucking emo circles. That practice was widespread throughout a lot of the planet. Oh my god. That is what I said as kind of like a me just hypothesizing is actually like in the sutras, the explanation. Quote, a symbolic representation of his wisdom and compassion, as well as his ability to hear and understand the suffering of all beings. I like the gauge theory too. I feel like we gotta combo them. This is about synthesis here. Yeah, we'll just say that one of the religious groups that he practiced in was like some weird like emo hedonist group, and they had him install gauges, and that just lingers. That's my headcanon. It's official. This is no longer the polycanon. This is the headcanon. Correct. Yeah, so some there are other depictions that I'm reading that describe that like it may be representative of his past as being a nobleman, the like juxtaposition that he used to have a lot of adornments and now he is very plain and bare in appearance. Okay, so I'm gonna turn on window capture. So this is my shrine that I keep in my bedroom. Typically you want your own separate space for it, but your boy broke and don't have a lot of room. So these are Tibetan thangkas. Well, they were both made in Nepal, but they're practicing Tibetan style Buddhism. And so let me just slide this over here. As you can see, they're kind of intense. I'll zoom in a bit more. The one on the right is Manjushri, the Buddha of Wisdom. And so he has a similar ear adornment, and you can see he actually has piercings. But he sits in a very particular posture, and in Tibetan Buddhism, some of the practices involve a lot of deep visualization. And so in one hand, he has a sword that is meant to cut through deceit and delusions on the path towards wisdom. On the other hand, it's a bit hard to see, but he holds a book that sprouts a flower, and that's meant to represent, like, you know, the teachings, the Dharma itself. The thangka on the left is a bit more niche. This is the Dharma protector, Mahakala. Mahakala is basically Buddhist Shiva. Shiva being the Hindu god of destruction and rebirth or recreation, so to speak. And so Mahakala in a Buddhist framework represents a very intense sort of self-rediscovery, destruction of craving in a very intense way. It's a very complicated subject that I couldn't even begin to get into the logistics without a lot of context. And so then down below we have a lot more, and you see that they all have different postures. I have some for Amitabha, another one of the Buddhas. I have Tsongkhapa, which is like one of the key founders of one of the major branches of Tibetan Buddhism. We have a Black Manjushri, which is like a very, very intense version. And then several different depictions of Avalokiteshvara, or Kanon. This is a Japanese one. One of my friends that I've lost contact with, I'm really hoping to try to reconnect with him. He is a Zen Buddhist monk, and so one of the last times he went to Japan, he brought back some Zen Mahayana versions of like this style of depiction, and so that's these ones down on the ground. And then it's pretty jank, but I have my daily water offering cup. It's a very simple ritual that you can do every day. You place the water, and you give acknowledgement to the three jewels: the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha. The Buddha being obvious, the Buddha and his, you know, that idea of Buddhahood. The Dharma, or the teachings of the Buddha. And then finally the Sangha, or the Buddhist community. And so even something as simple as the act of a water offering, where you set the water before the shrine and you give acknowledgement to the three jewels, that is believed to kind of be a sort of daily practice that one can do to better, like, maintain a simple right livelihood of appreciation for things. All right, and that concludes this one. So for the next one, we will be moving into a pretty complex topic. Chapter 5 is everything suffering. It can sometimes feel like it with the wording. It's an interesting one. I hope some people will continue to come to that one. I intend on uploading all of these to YouTube in pieces. I wasn't sure how this was gonna go, but I hope I can stick to it and continue this project myself.